The night shift, the factory never really slept. It was built on a flat stretch of land just outside Asheville, where the town's lights thinned out into rail lines, scrub fields, and a sludgy canal that hadn't seen a barge in years. By day, the Asheville steelworks still gave off the impression of industry. Men in reflective vests smoking outside the gates, delivery trucks thundering past, and the rhythmic clang of machines echoing against the corrugated walls. But by night, when the workers dwindled down to a skeleton crew, the place felt like a carcass, still humming with echoes, but hollow on the inside. Ethan Callahan knew that silence better than anyone. He'd been on the night shift for nearly 7 years now. 7 winters of trudging across the frozen gravel at 11 p.m., of signing his name in the logbook under the jaundiced glow of the security booth, of listening to his own boots echo across the wide, empty bays. He was 52, though his spine and his lungs would have argued 60. The years had stacked on him like iron plates. Grime under the nails, scars that looked like cracks in old stone, shoulders hunched not just from work, but from life itself. Seasoned worker. That's what the supervisors called men like him. It sounded better than burned out. It sounded better than forgotten. The truth was simpler. Ethan had outlasted the others. The younger guys quit after a few months, chasing better jobs. The middle-aged men found daytime shifts or found excuses. Ethan stayed, not out of loyalty, but because the night shift didn't demand explanations. No one asked about his failed marriage, about his son who hadn't spoken to him in years, about what he did with his lonely days when he stumbled home from work at dawn. The night shift was a graveyard, and Ethan belonged among the ghosts. The factory's sounds had a rhythm of their own. He'd learned to read them the way a woodsman reads a forest. The low growl of the blast furnaces still cooling after the day's run, the constant hiss of pipes bleeding steam, the distant clatter of conveyor belts that never fully stopped. And beneath it all, a hum. A vibration in the bones of the building, as though the steel itself still carried echoes of its making. That night began like any other. Ethan clocked in at 11:06 p.m., signed his name with the same dull pen, and made his rounds with a flashlight that barely cut through the haze. The factory floor stretched out in dim rows of shadow and machinery, smelling of oil, rust, and scorched metal. Above him, the ceiling beams disappeared into darkness, dripping condensation from the cold. He made his way past the furnaces, now shut down, their great mouths sealed like slumbering beasts. Past the rolling mill, where slabs of steel once screamed as they were pressed flat. Past the empty locker rooms where the day's shift had left behind a stink of sweat and aftershave. Nothing unusual. And yet, he paused. Somewhere beneath the hum, another sound threaded its way into the silence. It was faint, almost imagined at first, like wind squeezing through a broken pane, or like singing. Ethan froze. He raised a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the empty floor. Shadows shifted against machines. Nothing moved. The sound slipped away. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm. Probably just the pipes. They groaned and hissed in ways that could trick the ears. Sometimes, if he hadn't slept well, he'd swear they whispered to him. But that was fatigue, nothing more. Still, he took the long way around the West Bay, avoiding the far corridor where the sound had seemed strongest. By 1 a.m., he sat in the break room with a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a stale ham sandwich. The vending machine buzzed in the corner, half its lights dead. On the wall above a table, a faded poster still read, "Safety IS Everyone's Job," with a cartoon hard hat smiling like a fool. Ethan chewed in silence. The factory was never kind to the imagination, but nights like this, when the shadows seemed thicker, the silence sharper, were the worst. It wasn't just loneliness. It was weight. The steelworks had a history, one that locals whispered about in bars. There had been accidents, men crushed by machines, burned alive, pulled under cranes. The place had a body count, and though management painted over it with fresh signs and empty slogans, Ethan knew the weight of it lingered. You couldn't work here long without feeling it. Sometimes, on quieter nights, he swore he wasn't the only one walking the halls. He finished a sandwich, washed it down with bitter coffee, and almost convinced himself to laugh at his own nerves. Almost. That's when he heard it again. Softer this time, like a lullaby carried through walls. The same elusive melody, weaving just beyond reach. Not pipes, not wind, something else. He stood slowly, every joint protesting, and listened. The hum of machinery seemed to part, and the sound grew clearer. A woman's voice, low and mournful, the kind of song that rose from somewhere deeper than words. His skin prickled. He'd grown up with stories, Irish blood on his mother's side, tales of banshees and keening women. But this wasn't childhood lore. This was here, now, inside the walls. The singing stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed was worse. He made another round, moving slower this time. His flashlight beam danced across steel beams, conveyor belts, and idle machines. Each corner seemed heavier, shadows clinging longer. He found himself drawn toward the West Bay, the one he'd avoided earlier. Something in him resisted, but another part couldn't let it go. The West Bay was the oldest part of the steel works. Some said it was original to factories, founding in the 1920s. The floor was cracked, the rafters blackened by decades of smoke. Few workers ever came this way anymore. The newer lines had long replaced its usefulness. As Ethan entered, the temperature dropped. He could see his breath, pale against the dark. He swept the flashlight across the cavernous space. Rusted hooks dangled from overhead rails. Dust stirred in his wake. The far wall loomed with bolted steel doors, long sealed shut. And there, in the center of the room, stood water. A shallow pool stretched across the cracked concrete, rippling as though stirred by unseen hands. The factory roof was intact. There should have been no water. Ethan stepped closer. His boots echoed. The air smelled faintly of salt, impossible this far inland. The pool quivered, and from its center came the sound again. Singing. Low. Beautiful. Terrible. The melody curled through him like smoke, seeping into marrow, into memory. It was longing, grief, desire, all tangled into a sound too ancient for words. His knees weakened, his chest ached. He knew he should turn back, run. Instead, he leaned closer, as though his body were no longer his own. Shapes flickered in the water, faces pale and distant. A woman's hair streaming like weeds, eyes that opened too wide, too dark, lips moving in song. Ethan staggered back, the spell breaking. The beam of his flashlight jittered, slicing across the water. The faces dissolved. The singing stopped. He stood alone in the silence, heart hammering. The pool lay still, and then, with a sound like something dragging across steel, one of the sealed doors on the far wall groaned. Just slightly, just enough to shiver open a crack. Blackness yawned beyond. Ethan didn't sleep that day. He returned home at dawn, sat on the edge of his bed, and stared at the wall. His hands shook when he lit his first cigarette. For the first time in years, he thought of calling his son, just to hear a voice, just to remind himself the world outside the factory still existed. But the phone stayed cold in his hand. By evening, he was already dreading the next shift. And yet, beneath that dread, something else lingered. The song. It haunted him long after the factory was behind him. Not as fear, at least not entirely, but as something heavier. Something that felt like it had been waiting for him all along. Echoes in the walls. Ethan arrived for his next shift with a weight in his chest he couldn't shake. The morning after the song, he'd tried to tell himself it was a hallucination. He'd been tired, his nerves stretched thin. Maybe it was just the hissing of pipes or the groan of steel carrying through the rafters. Factories had a way of sounding alive at night. Everyone knew that. But factories didn't grow pools of salt water on their floors. Factories didn't sing. By the time the sun sank behind Asheville, he was already restless, smoking on the back step until his fingers ached from the cold. His neighbors' houses glowed with warm light, families moving behind curtains. Ethan flicked the cigarette into the slush and turned away. He had no one waiting, no excuses to call out. The factory consumed its own. He punched in at 11:02. The guard barely looked at him. Inside, the building exhaled its familiar breath of oil, smoke, and rust. Shadows crawled long across the floor, broken by pockets of pale, buzzing light. Ethan felt the shift before he even started rounds. The air carried a charge, the way it did before a thunderstorm. He told himself he was imagining it, but his skin prickled all the same. The West Bay. He avoided it at first, sticking to his usual loop: locker rooms, rolling mill, the blast furnaces. Everything seemed routine, quiet, but his thoughts dragged him back. He replayed the sound of the singing in his head, over and over, that mournful melody, the ache it stirred in his bones. He remembered the faces in the water, pale, shifting, dissolving, and the door, the sealed steel door that had grown open of its own accord. The thought gnawed at him until finally, against every instinct, he veered from his usual path. His boots echoed as he crossed into the West Bay. The cold hit him immediately. The air here wasn't just chill, it was heavy, damp, the kind of cold that clung to clothes and seeped into marrow. His flashlight beam swept across the cracked floor. The pool was still there, gleaming faintly in the dark. Only this time, it was larger. It stretched nearly twice as far as before, water licking at the bases of rusted machines. Ripples spread across its surface, though nothing touched it. And faintly, just faintly, he thought he heard voices beneath the hum of the factory. Not singing, not yet. Just whispers, like breath against the ear. Ethan froze. Then, from the corner of the bay, he heard movement. He snapped the flashlight toward it, the beam cutting across steel columns. Shadows shifted. A man stood there. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure was dressed in coveralls, a hard hat tilted back on his head. His face was pale, his eyes dark hollows. For a moment, Ethan thought he was looking at another worker. Someone left over from the day's shift, maybe, but the man was wrong. His outline wavered, not quite solid. His boots didn't touch the ground. And then Ethan realized he recognized him. Bill Cormack. Bill had worked the night shift 15 years ago. Ethan remembered the accident clear as day. The crane that failed, the slab of steel that had pinned him before anyone could reach him. Bill had died here, in the West Bay. Now he stood 10 feet away, his head bent, as though listening to something far off. Ethan's mouth went dry. Bill? The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed toward the pool. Ethan stumbled back. No. The whispering rose into a hum. The water rippled harder, as though something stirred beneath. And just as suddenly as he'd appeared, Bill was gone. The space where he'd stood lay empty, the shadows still. Ethan's flashlight shook in his hand. His chest heaved. He turned and fled the West Bay, boots hammering against concrete. He locked himself in the break room for nearly an hour, chain smoking until his lungs burned. Ghosts. Singing pools. Doors opening where no man had entered in decades. He thought of quitting, walking out, calling management in the morning, and telling them he was done. But even as the thought formed, he knew it wouldn't happen. He was bound to this place. He had nowhere else to go. And more than that, he needed to know something lived in those walls. Something older than the factory. And it wanted him to hear. By dawn, Ethan felt like a man half dreaming. He stumbled home, pulled the curtains shut, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come. When he finally drifted, it was to dreams of water, endless dark water, waves rising against the beams of the steelworks, voices rising with it, women's voices, weaving in sorrow and hunger. And beneath the melody, he thought he heard names. Bill, others, and his own. That evening, before his shift, Ethan stopped at a bar he hadn't been to in years. The kind of place where the stools wobbled and the regulars nursed beers until closing. He ordered whiskey and sat hunched over the glass. When the bartender wandered over, Ethan asked before he could second-guess himself, "You ever hear stories about the steelworks? About the night shift?" The man gave him a look, tired and knowing. Everyone's heard stories. Places cursed. Always has been. What kind of stories? Ethan pressed. The bartender leaned on the counter. Depends who you ask. Some say the ground was bad before they even built it. Old riverbed. Others say it's the men who died there, sticking around. But I've heard one thing more than once. What's that? That sometimes, late at night, you can hear women singing in there. Ethan's stomach dropped. The bartender shrugged. Sailors used to talk about that too. Out on the water. said it meant you were about to go under. Ethan stared into his glass. Not wind, not pipes, not his imagination. The factory was singing, and it wanted him to listen. At 11 p.m., Ethan clocked in again. His hands shook as he signed the log. He didn't even pretend to avoid the West Bay this time. The song was waiting for him. As soon as he stepped inside, it rose, low, haunting, threaded with sorrow. The pool gleamed under the weak beam of his flashlight, rippling like it breathed, and standing on the far edge of the water were 3 figures. Women. Their shapes were faint, wavering, but their eyes glowed pale in the dark. Hair spilled around them like seaweed, streaming though no wind stirred. Their lips moved, weaving the melody. Ethan's knees buckled. The song filled him, pressed against his ribs until his heart staggered. It was beautiful, terrible. He staggered forward, boots splashing into the edge of the water before he caught himself. The women reached out pale hands. And behind them, just for a heartbeat, Ethan thought he saw the silhouettes of men, dozens of them, half submerged in the water, their faces slack, their eyes blank. Men he recognized. Workers, night shifters. Lost of the song. Ethan stumbled back, gasping, tearing himself free of the pool. The women's voices rose, sharp with hunger. The water churned, black waves slapping against concrete. And then silence. The bay lay empty. The pool still. Only Ethan remained, heart thundering, breath ragged. He fell to his knees, the truth sinking cold into his bones. The steelworks wasn't haunted by its dead. It was feeding them, and now it wanted him. The sirens returned. Ethan didn't remember leaving the West Bay. He remembered the song rising, the pale hands reaching, the faces of men half drowned in black water. He remembered the taste of salt in the air, sharp and biting like ocean spray. He remembered the overwhelming urge to step into the pool, to sink into its embrace and never come back. And then silence. When his senses returned, he was sitting in the break room with a cigarette burning low between his fingers, ash spilling onto the table. His clothes were damp with sweat. His boots were wet. For a long time, he just sat there, trying to steady his breathing. Every instinct told him to walk away, to never go back. But another voice, quieter and steadier, whispered that walking away was impossible. The factory had chosen him. And somewhere deep down, Ethan knew he needed to understand why. The archives. The next morning, instead of collapsing into bed, Ethan drove into town. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind churned too violently for sleep. Asheville's public library was nearly empty at that hour. Only a few students and retirees scattered at tables. Ethan asked the librarian about local history, about the steelworks, and she directed him to the basement archives. The air down there was cold, dry, heavy with dust. Ethan paged through microfilm newspapers, eyes burning as headlines flickered past. Explosion at Asheville Steelworks. 32 confirmed dead. Families demand investigation. Company promises stronger safety protocols. Article after article, spanning decades. But one detail repeated, buried in interviews and offhand remarks. Survivors swore they'd heard alarms and voices, singing moments before the catastrophe. The sound had drawn some men toward the blast zone, sealing their fates. Ethan leaned closer, pulse quickening. In an article from 1912, years before the explosion, a quote from a foreman leapt out at him. Some nights, the lads say they hear women's voices in the rafters, like something calling them down to the river. Told them it's just the wind, but it don't sound like wind to me. And in a later clipping, after another fatal accident, they ain't human voices. They're older, hungrier. This ground wasn't meant for us to build on. Ethan sat back, heart hammering. It hadn't started with the explosion. The singing went back as far as the factory itself. Maybe even further. What the hell had Asheville been built on? Confessions at the bar. That night, Ethan found himself back at the bar. The same bartender eyed him as he ordered whiskey. "You look worse," the man muttered. Ethan swallowed a mouthful of burn before answering. "What's buried under the steelworks?" The bartender stilled, rag in hand. "What are you talking about?" "I've read the papers. I've heard the stories. The singing. The accidents. This isn't just bad luck. What's under that ground? The man hesitated, glancing around the room before leaning closer. His voice dropped. Long before there was a factory, there was a river, wide, deep, and fast. The old tribes here, Cherokee, maybe Shawnee, depends who you ask. They called it cursed water, said spirits lived there. Women's voices, pulling men under. Ethan's blood went cold. The man shrugged. Town fathers dammed it up in the late 1800s, redirected it underground to make way for the mill. But you can't bury a river. You can't bury what lives in it, either. Ethan gripped his glass hard enough to hurt. Sirens. Not just myth, not just sea stories. Here, beneath his feet. Still singing. Still hungry. The sirens in the flesh. Back at the factory, the night felt heavier than ever. The machinery groaned like it senses knowledge. The air thrummed with energy, pressing against his skin. He lasted until 2 a.m. before the first notes rose. This time, there was no hesitation. The song swelled, curling to the rafters, wrapping around his chest like a net. He walked as though pulled by strings, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The West Bay was alive. The pool surged, black water bubbling as though fed by something deep below. Steam curled upward, carrying the salt sting of the sea. And there they were, the three women clearer now, their faces pale and perfect, eyes glowing faintly gold. They smiled when they saw him. "Ethan," one whispered, though her lips barely moved. He staggered. His name. They knew his name. "You're tired," another sang. "So tired. Come rest." Their voices weren't just sound, they were touch. They slid into his ears, into his mind, coiling through his thoughts. His body ached to obey, to wade forward, to sink into their waiting arms. Behind them, the drowned men shifted, eyes vacant. Workers he'd known, Bill and others lost across decades, floating half-submerged, their mouths slack as though still trying to sing. Ethan's knees bent without his permission. His boot touched water. The chill shot through him like knives. For a moment, he almost let go, almost surrendered. But something broke through. A memory. His father, coughing steel dust into his hands, telling Ethan never to trust a factory. It takes more than it gives. It'll hollow you out if you let it. Ethan wrenched himself back, gasping. The women's smiles faltered, their songs sharpened into anger, the pitch rising until his ears rang. The water churned violently, waves crashing against the walls. The whole bay trembled, and then, with a sound like tearing metal, one of the rusted machines roared to life. Sparks flew, gears turned though no hand touched them. The factory itself was waking, the siren's promise. Ethan ran, but the voices followed, echoing through every corridor. "You can't leave us, Ethan. You're already ours. Every man who hears us belongs to the water." He staggered into the control room, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he gripped the console, heart slamming. Through the glass, shadows rippled, pale shapes moving just out of sight. The alarms wailed suddenly, shrill and piercing, though no buttons had been pressed. Red light strobed, painting the walls in pulses of blood. Ethan realized, with a sick lurch, that the sirens had taken control. Not just the voices, the alarms themselves. They were the same. The factory alarms weren't warnings. They were lures. They always had been. Revelation. By the time dawn crept pale through the skylights, the voices had receded. Ethan stumbled into the freezing air outside, shaking, exhausted, broken. He understood now. The steelworks wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed by accident or bad ground. It was built on a mouth. A river where sirens lived, dammed and smothered under concrete and iron, but never silenced. They had adapted, feeding through alarms and songs, luring men deeper, taking them one by one. And now, after years of watching him, of whispering in the corners of his nights, they had chosen Ethan. He was marked. That night, he stood in his kitchen staring at a bottle of pills and a pack of cigarettes. He thought about leaving town, thought about running. But somewhere deep inside, he already knew the truth. There was no leaving. The sirens had his name, and sooner or later, He would answer. The last shift, the silence before. The night Ethan returned to factory, the silence was worse than any sound. No humming machines, no dripping pipes, no creak of shifting steel. The entire place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Ethan gripped his flashlight tighter, feeling its weight like a lifeline. His boots echoed hollowly across the concrete, each step reverberating as though the steelworks itself were listening. He told himself he had a choice, that he didn't have to come back. He could have left Asheville, could have vanished into some city where the voices couldn't follow. But deep down, he knew better. He hadn't been summoned here tonight by accident. The sirens weren't finished with him, and he wasn't finished with them. The awakening. The West Bay door was already open when he arrived. A draft rolled out, damp and briny, stinking faintly of saltwater and rot. Inside, the pool churned violently, frost slapping against the walls like an angry tide. Rusted beams shuddered as though caught in a storm. And the voices, they didn't whisper now. They sang full and strong, weaving together in harmonies too beautiful to be human. Their words weren't English or any language Ethan knew, but the meaning slithered into him nonetheless. Welcome, welcome home. He stepped closer despite himself. His flashlight beam cut across the water, catching pale figures rising from the depths. The drowned men, countless more than before, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They swayed in unison, like puppets pulled by unseen strings. Behind them, the three women rose, luminous and terrible. Their beauty was unbearable, too sharp, too perfect. Their hair flowed like liquid midnight, their eyes shimmering gold. And they smiled at him. "You came back," one whispered, though her voice filled the entire bay. "I didn't have a choice," Ethan rasped. "There's always a choice," another sang, stepping onto the surface of the water as though it were solid. She drifted closer, feet never sinking, her hand outstretched. "Join us. Rest. The work is over." The factory groans. The ground shuddered beneath Ethan's feet. Machinery long dead roared to life, gears grinding, chains snapping tight. The factory screamed like a beast stirring from slumber. Red lights blazed overhead, spinning in dizzying arcs. The alarms wailed. Only now Ethan could hear the truth. The alarms weren't mechanical at all. They were voices. Every shriek, every warning siren that had ever split the night. Sirens calling men not to safety, but to their deaths. The walls dripped. Water leaked from cracks in the ceiling, trickling down in thin streams. Asheville Steelworks wasn't just above the river. It was becoming the river. Ethan staggered back, clutching his ears as the song grew unbearable. "Stop," he shouted, voice raw. "I know what you are. I know what you've done." The three women only tilted their heads, smiling serenely. "We've fed your fathers, your grandfathers, every man who ever worked these halls," one said, her voice silk over razors. "We gave them peace. We gave them rest." "You killed them," Ethan spat. "We kept them," another corrected, gesturing to the drowned men swaying in the pool. Their lips moved now, silently echoing the women's song. "They are with us. Forever." The sirens embrace. The nearest siren stepped forward. So close now Ethan could see the tiny flecks of gold in her eyes. Her hand hovered inches from his cheek, cool mist clinging to her fingers. "Why fight?" she murmured. "The factory takes everything from you. It always has. Let us give you release. No more night shifts. No more loneliness. Only song." Her words burrowed deep. She wasn't wrong. The steelworks had taken everything. His father's lungs, his own freedom, his sanity. And the pull of her voice was so sweet, so heavy, it promised an end to all of it. For one dizzy moment, Ethan leaned forward, lips parting to breathe her in. But then he saw his father's face again. Saw him coughing up black dust, skin gray, eyes pleading. "Don't let it take you, son." Ethan tore himself away with a cry, stumbling backward. The siren's face twisted, her beauty cracking into something jagged, her teeth sharp as knives. The pool roared. Water surged upward in towering waves, crashing against the walls, spilling across the floor. Drowned men lurched forward, arms outstretched. They were coming for him. Fire and flood. Ethan's gaze darted to the old emergency console near the wall. Most of the controls were dead, but one switch gleamed red in the flashing lights. Burn OFF system. Back when the mill was active, it had been a last resort, a way to purge toxic spills with fire. His only chance. He sprinted, boots splashing through rising water, voices clawing at his mind. Hands grabbed at his arms, cold and slimy, but he ripped free, slamming his weight into the console. The switch stuck for a moment, then gave. With a thunderous roar, the furnaces in the adjoining bay ignited, flames leaping skyward. Heat blasted across the factory, rolling over him like a wave. The sirens screamed, their song shattering into shrill wails. Their perfect faces contorted with rage as the flames spread, licking hungrily at rusted beams. The drowned men convulsed, their glowing eyes dimming as smoke filled the air. One by one, they collapsed into the water, their bodies sinking. But the fire had consequences. The structure groaned, buckled, beams snapped like bones. Concrete split as boiling water forced its way upward. The river was breaking free. Collapse. Ethan ran, coughing smoke, as the factory tore itself apart. The song chased him through every corridor, desperate and furious, promising pain, promising rest, promising everything if only he turned back. But he kept going. Behind him, the West Bay exploded in a geyser of water and fire, a roar that shook the earth. The siren shrieked one last time, a sound of rage and sorrow so piercing it split his skull. And then silence. The factory collapsing on itself, swallowed by the river beneath. Aftermath. Dawn found Ethan slumped on the hill overlooking the ruins. Asheville Steelworks was gone. Only a smoldering crater remained, water pooling where the bay had been. No voices rose from it. For the first time in weeks, the air was still, but Ethan knew the truth. The river was still there. The sirens were still there. They had been hurt, but not destroyed. Something that old couldn't die in fire. They would wait. They would rebuild their song. And they would remember him. As the sun rose over Asheville, painting the smoke gold, Ethan lit a cigarette with shaking hands. His body was exhausted, but his mind was sharp with one certainty. He hadn't escaped. Not really. The sirens had lost their factory, but they hadn't lost their hunger. And one night soon, when the world was quiet and the water was rising, they would call for him again. And this time, he wasn't sure he'd resist.